She thought it was a masked fantasy, a single night of escape in the arms of a mysterious stranger in his opulent coastal mansion. But when the masks came off, she discovered he wasn't just a billionaire. He was the powerful judge deciding her entire future. If you love elegant romance stories with billionaires, subscribe to the channel and join our family. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. It began with the gentle clinking of crystal, a sound that seemed to hang in the air like a delicate chandelier, a fragile melody against the deep rhythmic sigh of the ocean just beyond the windows. Nancy Sanders adjusted the soft silk of the mask on her face, the unfamiliar fabric a cool caress against her skin. For this one night, she had given herself permission to shed her own identity, to silence the pragmatic engineer who spent her days fighting for her family's legacy. Tonight she was simply an enigma. The invitation had been a whisper, a promise of an escape into a world of pure fantasy at the famed annual masquerade ball. The setting was a legend in itself, a sprawling mansion known as the Sentinel, a modern fortress of glass and stone that clung to the cliffs of the coast like a diamond set in rock. The very name promised security, a refuge from the storms of life, and Nancy needed that refuge more than she was willing to admit. Even to herself, she drifted through rooms adorned with art that seemed to whisper stories from centuries past, the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive perfume mingling in the air. The weight of the impending legal battle, a shadow that had followed her for months, began to feel distant. Here, surrounded by such deliberate and breathtaking beauty, the rigid lines of her professional life started to blur, replaced by a soft, hopeful curiosity about the anonymous host who had orchestrated this grand illusion. Her eyes scanned the crowd of masked figures, all playing their part in the opulent theater. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that shimmered like captured starlight, moved with a practiced, easy grace. Yet amidst the sea of glittering strangers, Nancy felt a profound and familiar sense of solitude. It was the quiet loneliness of a leader, of someone who carried the weight of others' futures on her shoulders. Seeking a moment of genuine peace, she found herself drawn toward a secluded balcony, away from the polite laughter and the swelling orchestra. She needed a moment with the sea, the only thing that felt truly real in this world of carefully constructed fantasies. It was there, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, that she first saw him, a still point in her turning world. He was leaning against the cold stone balustrade, a silhouette of quiet power against the moonlit ocean. His presence was an island of stillness in the swirling social currents behind them. He wore a simple, unadorned black mask that did little to hide the commanding set of his shoulders or the thoughtful inclination of his head as he stared out into the endless darkness of the water, seemingly lost in his own world. As she stepped into the cool night air, he turned. His movement was unhurried, graceful, but his gaze was immediate and intense. It seemed to bypass the silk and satin of her mask entirely, peering directly into the part of her she kept hidden from the world. It was a look of startling recognition, as if he had been waiting for her all along. This was where the story truly began, not with a word, but with a look. He didn't speak at first. He simply offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, an invitation not into a conversation, but into his silence. It was a gesture of profound respect, acknowledging her presence without demanding anything in return. Nancy found herself standing beside him, the space between them charged with an unspoken understanding, some shared need for this quiet escape from the gilded cage of the party. The murmur of the ball faded into a distant hum, replaced by the powerful sound of waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a sound of immense, raw power, yet it was also deeply calming, a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the frantic beating of her own heart, coaxing it into a slower, more deliberate tempo. She took a deep breath, the salty air cleansing her lungs, and felt a knot of tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cool night air, a perfect harmony to the ocean's deep bass. "Sometimes the most beautiful view," he began, his gaze still fixed on the dark, shifting horizon, "is the one furthest from the noise." His words were not a line. They were a shared observation, a thread of connection offered in the darkness. Nancy felt an immediate pull, a sense of kinship with this stranger. He understood. She turned her head slightly, the profile of his strong jaw starkly beautiful in the moonlight. Or perhaps, she countered softly, her own voice steadier than she expected. The noise makes you appreciate the view more when you finally find it. A small smile touched her lips, hidden behind her mask. The game had begun. He turned his body fully toward her then, and the world seemed to shrink, until it was only the two of them on that stone perch, suspended between the glittering fantasy of the party and the raw, untamed reality of the sea. "A fascinating perspective," he murmured, his eyes deep and searching, holding hers. "It implies that chaos has a purpose." The air grew thick with a palpable tension, the kind that precedes a summer storm or a first kiss. She saw in his posture a man accustomed to carrying great weight, yet in his eyes she saw the same flicker of longing that had brought her to this balcony. This wasn't just attraction, it was a profound, almost unnerving sense of recognition. This man, this stranger, seemed to understand the language of her soul without ever having learned it, and a delicious shiver of anticipation coursed through her. The music from the ballroom shifted, a slow hypnotic melody winding its way out into the night. Wrapping around them like a silken ribbon, it was a waltz, a song made for stolen moments and secret romances. It felt as if the anonymous host had orchestrated this very moment, just for them. He was about to change the rules of their quiet game. He extended a hand, his palm facing upward in a gesture of classic, undeniable elegance. The invitation was clear in his eyes, long before he spoke the words. His movement was as sure and confident as his voice, betraying a man accustomed to leading, to taking charge. Yet there was a gentleness in it, a respect that made the offer feel less like a demand and more like a shared conspiracy. "Would you grant a stranger a dance?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that was nearly swallowed by the sound of the surf. He then gestured with his head, not back toward the glittering ballroom, but out toward the dark expanse of the ocean. "Out here," he added, a hint of a smile in his tone, "where the music is better." It was a wonderfully absurd, deeply romantic invitation she couldn't possibly refuse. A genuine laugh, the first in weeks, bubbled up from her chest. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, a jolt of pure electricity shot up her arm. It was startling in its intensity, a spark of warmth that chased away the last of the evening's chill. His grip was firm yet impossibly gentle, a living paradox of strength and tenderness that seemed to be the very essence of the man himself. He didn't pull her into a formal, structured waltz. Instead, he drew her close and simply began to sway, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that perfectly matched the rise and fall of the waves below. Their bodies moved together with an unnerving familiarity, as if they had danced like this 1,000 times before in 1,000 other lives. The expensive, soft wool of his tuxedo jacket felt impossibly smooth beneath her fingertips. They danced in a comfortable, charged silence, their eyes locked in a conversation far more intimate than any words could be. Nancy could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the layers of their clothing, a rhythm that was calm and reassuring, grounding her in the dizzying moment. It was a heartbeat that spoke of immense control and hidden depths. In a gesture of complete and utter surrender, she let her head rest against the solid wall of his chest. It felt both reckless and entirely natural. In response, his hand moved from her waist to the small of her back, pressing her just a little closer. It was a gesture of possession, of quiet protection, and it made her feel safer than she had in years. The forced proximity was intoxicating, a slow burn of desire that she welcomed with every fiber of her being. The scent of him filled her senses, a subtle and sophisticated mix of crisp linen, a hint of sandalwood cologne and the clean, salty air of the ocean itself. As the song from inside faded into silence, they didn't stop moving. The only music now was the crashing of the waves and the soft sound of their own breathing, mingling in the space between them. He lowered his head, his lips hovering just an inch from hers, and the entire world simply stopped. She knew with absolute certainty that she was about to be kissed. She thought it was a masked fantasy, a single night of escape in the arms of a mysterious stranger in his opulent coastal mansion. But when the masks came off, she discovered he wasn't just a billionaire. He was the powerful judge deciding her entire future. If you love elegant romance stories with billionaires, subscribe to the channel and join our family. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. It began with the gentle clinking of crystal, a sound that seemed to hang in the air like a delicate chandelier, a fragile melody against the deep rhythmic sigh of the ocean just beyond the windows. Nancy Sanders adjusted the soft silk of the mask on her face, the unfamiliar fabric a cool caress against her skin. For this one night, she had given herself permission to shed her own identity, to silence the pragmatic engineer who spent her days fighting for her family's legacy. Tonight, she was simply an enigma. The invitation had been a whisper, a promise of an escape into a world of pure fantasy at the famed annual masquerade ball. The setting was a legend in itself, a sprawling mansion known as the Sentinel, a modern fortress of glass and stone that clung to the cliffs of the coast like a diamond set in rock. The very name promised security, a refuge from the storms of life, and Nancy needed that refuge more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. She drifted through rooms adorned with art that seemed to whisper stories from centuries past, the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive perfume mingling in the air. The weight of the impending legal battle, a shadow that had followed her for months, began to feel distant. Here, surrounded by such deliberate and breathtaking beauty, the rigid lines of her professional life started to blur, replaced by a soft, hopeful curiosity about the anonymous host who had orchestrated this grand illusion. Her eyes scanned the crowd of masked figures, all playing their part in the opulent theater. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that shimmered like captured starlight moved with a practiced, easy grace. Yet amidst the sea of glittering strangers, Nancy felt a profound and familiar sense of solitude. It was the quiet loneliness of a leader, of someone who carried the weight of others' futures on her shoulders. Seeking a moment of genuine peace, she found herself drawn toward a secluded balcony, away from the polite laughter and the swelling orchestra. She needed a moment with the sea, the only thing that felt truly real in this world of carefully constructed fantasies. It was there, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, that she first saw him, a still point in her turning world. He was leaning against the cold stone balustrade, a silhouette of quiet power against the moonlit ocean. His presence was an island of stillness in the swirling social currents behind them. He wore a simple, unadorned black mask that did little to hide the commanding set of his shoulders or the thoughtful inclination of his head as he stared out into the endless darkness of the water, seemingly lost in his own world. As she stepped into the cool night air, he turned. His movement was unhurried, graceful, but his gaze was immediate and intense. It seemed to bypass the silk and satin of her mask entirely, peering directly into the part of her she kept hidden from the world. It was a look of startling recognition, as if he had been waiting for her all along. This was where the story truly began, not with a word, but with a look. He didn't speak at first. He simply offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, an invitation not into a conversation, but into his silence. It was a gesture of profound respect, acknowledging her presence without demanding anything in return. Nancy found herself standing beside him, the space between them charged with an unspoken understanding, a shared need for this quiet escape from the gilded cage of the party. The murmur of the ball faded into a distant hum, replaced by the powerful sound of waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a sound of immense raw power, yet it was also deeply calming, a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the frantic beating of her own heart, coaxing it into a slower, more deliberate tempo. She took a deep breath, the salty air cleansing her lungs, and felt a knot of tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cool night air, a perfect harmony to the ocean's deep bass. "Sometimes the most beautiful view," he began, his gaze still fixed on the dark, shifting horizon, "is the one furthest from the noise." His words were not a line. They were a shared observation, a thread of connection offered in the darkness. Nancy felt an immediate pull, a sense of kinship with this stranger. He understood. She turned her head slightly, the profile of his strong jaw starkly beautiful in the moonlight. Or perhaps, she countered softly, her own voice steadier than she expected, the noise makes you appreciate the view more when you finally find it. A small smile touched her lips, hidden behind her mask. The game had begun. He turned his body fully toward her then, and the world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them on that stone perch, suspended between the glittering fantasy of the party and the raw, untamed reality of the sea. "A fascinating perspective," he murmured, his eyes deep and searching, holding hers. "It implies that chaos has a purpose." The air grew thick with a palpable tension, the kind that precedes a summer storm or a first kiss. She saw in his posture a man accustomed to carrying great weight, yet in his eyes she saw the same flicker of longing that had brought her to this balcony. This wasn't just attraction. It was a profound, almost unnerving sense of recognition. This man, this stranger, seemed to understand the language of her soul without ever having learned it, and a delicious shiver of anticipation coursed through her. The music from the ballroom shifted, a slow hypnotic melody winding its way out into the night, wrapping around them like a silken ribbon. It was a waltz, a song made for stolen moments and secret romances. It felt as if the anonymous host had orchestrated this very moment, just for them. He was about to change the rules of their quiet game. He extended a hand, his palm facing upward in a gesture of classic, undeniable elegance. The invitation was clear in his eyes long before he spoke the words. His movement was as sure and confident as his voice, betraying a man accustomed to leading, to taking charge. Yet there was a gentleness in it, a respect that made the offer feel less like a demand and more like a shared conspiracy. "Would you grant a stranger a dance?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that was nearly swallowed by the sound of the surf. He then gestured with his head, not back toward the glittering ballroom, but out toward the dark expanse of the ocean. "Out here," he added, a hint of a smile in his tone. "Where the music is better." It was a wonderfully absurd, deeply romantic invitation she couldn't possibly refuse. A genuine laugh, the first in weeks, bubbled up from her chest. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, a jolt of pure electricity shot up her arm. It was startling in its intensity, a spark of warmth that chased away the last of the evening's chill. His grip was firm yet impossibly gentle, a living paradox of strength and tenderness that seemed to be the very essence of the man himself. He didn't pull her into a formal, structured waltz. Instead, he drew her close and simply began to sway, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that perfectly matched the rise and fall of the waves below. Their bodies moved together with an unnerving familiarity, as if they had danced like this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 other lives. The expensive, soft wool of his tuxedo jacket felt impossibly smooth beneath her fingertips. They danced in a comfortable, charged silence, their eyes locked in a conversation far more intimate than any words could be. Nancy could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the layers of their clothing, a rhythm that was calm and reassuring, grounding her in the dizzying moment. It was a heartbeat that spoke of immense control and hidden depths. In a gesture of complete and utter surrender, she let her head rest against the solid wall of his chest. It felt both reckless and entirely natural. In response, his hand moved from her waist to the small of her back, pressing her just a little closer. It was a gesture of possession, of quiet protection, and it made her feel safer than she had in years. The forced proximity was intoxicating, a slow burn of desire that she welcomed with every fiber of her being. The scent of him filled her senses, a subtle and sophisticated mix of crisp linen, a hint of sandalwood cologne and the clean, salty air of the ocean itself. As the song from inside faded into silence, they didn't stop moving. The only music now was the crashing of the waves and the soft sound of their own breathing, mingling in the space between them. He lowered his head, his lips hovering just an inch from hers, and the entire world simply stopped. She knew with absolute certainty that she was about to be kissed. The first touch of his lips was a soft question, a moment of breathtaking hesitation. It was tentative, respectful, asking for permission she had already given with her eyes, with the way her body leaned into his. When she responded a silent and unequivocal yes, the pressure deepened. The kiss transformed from a gentle inquiry into a statement of profound, undeniable connection. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of discovery, of two solitudes meeting and recognizing each other in the dark. This wasn't the hurried, fumbling passion of a fleeting affair. It was something more significant, more deliberate. His hand slid from the small of her back up to her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear, sending shivers cascading down her spine. Nancy felt herself arching into him, her hands gripping the fine fabric of his shoulders, as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. The taste of him was a heady mix of expensive scotch and something uniquely, intoxicatingly his own. He pulled back, just enough for their foreheads to rest against each other, their breath mingling in the cool night air. His eyes' dark pools of emotion searched hers. "I don't even know your name," he whispered, his voice slightly rough, thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Nancy let out a soft, shaky laugh, feeling more herself in this moment with a stranger than she had in months. "And I don't know yours," she replied. "Tonight, does it matter?" With a silent agreement passing between them, he took her by the hand. His grip was a warm, reassuring pressure around hers as he led her away from the balcony. It was a mutual desire to leave the performance of the party behind and find a more authentic space. Every step they took together down the quiet, dimly lit corridors of the mansion felt both thrillingly forbidden and perfectly, inevitably fated. The path he chose was not toward the grand exit, but deeper into the silent, private heart of the mansion. The sound of the orchestra faded completely, replaced by the soft echo of their footsteps on the polished marble floors. The house seemed to be holding its breath, watching them. He finally stopped before a heavy, dark wood door, its surface gleaming in the soft light from a wall sconce. He turned to face her, releasing her hand to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, his eyes asking a silent question that his lips did not need to form. It was a clear point of no return, a threshold between the intoxicating fantasy of the night and a reality that could be far more intimate and far more complicated. She had a choice to make, and her entire body was screaming for her to say yes. Her answer was in the way she leaned into his touch, a silent signal of complete trust and undeniable desire. He seemed to understand. Taking his hand from her cheek, he reached for the ornate handle, his gaze never leaving hers as he pushed the heavy door open, revealing the room where their lives would irrevocably change. This room would be the beginning of their truth. The room, he revealed, was not the lavish guest suite she might have expected, a space designed for temporary, anonymous encounters. Instead, he had brought her to a personal library. It was a sanctuary, a cathedral of stories. Floor-to-ceiling shelves crafted from dark, rich mahogany were filled with thousands of books, their leather spines forming a beautiful, intellectual mosaic. A grand fireplace crackled softly in the corner, casting a warm, flickering glow over everything. The air itself was different in here, rich with the comforting, sacred scent of old paper, worn leather and wood smoke. This wasn't a room meant to impress guests. It was a room that held a piece of a man's soul. Nancy felt a wave of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He hadn't brought her to a bedroom to seduce her body. He had brought her to his library to unveil his mind. It was the most powerfully seductive gesture she could have ever imagined. "This is my favorite room," he said, his voice softer now, more vulnerable in the intimate space, a place where the world makes sense. He watched her closely, gauging her reaction, and she knew he was showing her something precious, something he didn't share with just anyone. Her heart swelled with a feeling that was dangerously close to something more than simple attraction. It was a profound and startling connection. She walked deeper into the room, her fingers ghosting over the spines of the leather-bound volumes. The titles were eclectic, a map of a brilliant and curious mind. Legal theory sat next to classic literature. Philosophy rested beside books on structural engineering. To a corner of her mind, the pragmatic engineer she couldn't entirely silence registered this last part with a jolt of surprise and admiration. He was a man of substance. Turning back to him, her silk mask suddenly felt superfluous, a silly, flimsy barrier to a connection that was now profoundly and irrevocably real. "You have a beautiful mind," she said, the words more honest than anything she had uttered all night. She saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of unguarded pleasure at her words. He had allowed her to see him, and she had understood. He closed the distance between them, his movement slow, deliberate, filled with an almost unbearable grace. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the edge of her mask. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that sent a fresh wave of heat curling through her stomach. She could only manage a slow, deliberate nod, her breath caught in her throat. The act of him untying the ribbon felt more intimate than their kiss. A moment of complete and total unveiling. With her mask gone, his gaze traveled over her face as if memorizing every line, every feature, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. Even more beautiful than I imagined, he breathed. Then, with a mirroring gesture of vulnerability that made her heart ache, he reached up and removed his own mask. And the fantasy shattered. The world tilted on its axis and came crashing down around her as she stared into the face of Judge Andrew Scott. Her safe harbor had just become the most dangerous place on earth. The name echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of her mind, Andrew Scott. It was not just a name. It was a verdict in itself, a final judgment on the beautiful, impossible fantasy she had allowed herself to build. The air in the library, once so rich with the scent of leather and history, suddenly felt thin, impossible to breathe. The warmth from the crackling fire seemed to retreat, leaving a profound and terrifying chill that settled deep within her bones. Her heart, which had been beating with a rhythm of excited anticipation, began to hammer against her ribs with a frantic, panicked beat. Every detail of him came into sharp, horrifying focus. The commanding presence she'd mistaken for simple confidence was the authority of the bench. The intelligent eyes that had seemed to see into her soul were the same analytical eyes that would soon scrutinize every aspect of her life's work. The man was inseparable from the judge. He saw the shift in her immediately. A flicker of confusion, then concern, crossed his handsome features. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still laced with the gentle warmth from moments before, a sound that was now a painful reminder of her own naivety. He took a small step toward her, a natural instinct to close the distance, to offer comfort, but Nancy flinched, taking an involuntary step back. It was a small, sharp movement, a physical recoil from a beautiful dream that had just revealed its nightmarish core. The action wounded him. She saw it in the sudden tightening of his jaw. He misunderstood her shock completely. He likely thought she was intimidated by his identity in a social sense, by the wealth and power the Sentinel represented. Or worse, he thought her retreat was a rejection of him, the man, now that the mystery of the mask was gone. He had no idea that his name was a dagger to her heart. She tried to form a word, an explanation, an excuse to flee, but her throat was tight, her tongue thick and useless. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind, a storm of pleasure and panic, of desire and dread. Had this been a trap? A cruel, calculated game to gain leverage in her case? She looked into his eyes, into the genuine confusion and hurt swirling there, and she knew instantly that it wasn't. He was as much a victim of this disastrous coincidence as she was. She could see the conflict warring within him as he processed her reaction. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to understanding every nuance of a situation, and her silent terror was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He saw her fear, and it made him want to protect her from the world. He had no idea that the danger she saw was him. Seeing her distress, Andrew immediately shifted his approach. The potential lover from moments ago vanished, replaced by a man whose instincts were clearly to soothe and protect. He held up his hands in a gesture of placation, creating a safe distance between them. The advance was over. He was no longer a man pursuing a woman, but a host caring for a guest who was clearly, for some unknown reason, in turmoil. His consideration was almost more painful than outright anger would have been. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in her internal storm. "I don't know what I've done, but please, don't be alarmed." He gestured not toward the door, but toward a pair of plush leather armchairs situated near the fireplace, their surfaces glowing in the warm light. "Sit, please, let me get you a glass of water, or something stronger." He was offering her comfort when all she wanted to do was bolt the door. Every rational instinct, every ounce of self-preservation she possessed, was screaming at her to run. She needed to invent a headache, feign an emergency, and put as many miles as possible between this mansion and her life. To stay was reckless. To stay was professional suicide. To stay was to invite a complication into her life that could destroy everything she had ever worked for. But her feet, like her heart, seemed to have staged a quiet rebellion. They felt rooted to the expensive Persian rug. She couldn't leave. The thought of walking out of that library, of never seeing him again, of letting this impossible connection evaporate into nothing, was unbearable. She looked at him, at the man behind the title, and she saw not the formidable judge but the lonely soul on the balcony who understood the language of the sea. She was drawn to that man, even as she feared what the judge could do to her. Finally finding her voice, she gave a small, shaky nod. Yes, she whispered, the word feeling momentous. Thank you. She walked on unsteady legs to one of the armchairs, sinking into the soft leather. It felt like a surrender. Andrew watched her for a moment, before moving to a small, elegant bar cart in the corner, his movements fluid and efficient. He returned with 2 heavy crystal glasses, filled with an amber liquid. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The spark was still there, a forbidden current of electricity that defied the cold, hard reality of their situation. "It's all right," he said gently, taking the seat opposite her. "You are safe here." The profound irony of his words hung in the air, a silent testament to their impossible predicament. Every instinct told her to run, but her heart had already chosen to stay, and so she stayed. They sat on opposite sides of the fireplace, the crackling flames between them, a poor imitation of the fire that had ignited on the balcony. The space that separated their chairs felt like a vast canyon, a chasm of professional ethics and unspoken truths. What followed was a conversation of ghosts and shadows, of 2 people speaking with complete emotional honesty while carefully navigating a minefield of facts. It was the most intimate lie she had ever been a part of. He didn't ask her name again, nor did he press her on why she had reacted so strongly. Instead, he simply began to talk. He spoke of the crushing loneliness that sometimes came with a life of immense responsibility, of living in a fortress of solitude where every interaction was weighed and measured. He spoke of his love for the sea, how its untamable nature was a comfort to a man whose world was governed by rigid rules and logic. He was giving her the pieces of his soul, without ever naming his profession. Listening to him, Nancy felt the hard knot of panic in her chest begin to loosen. She found herself responding in kind. She spoke of her own passion for creation, for the logic and beauty of building things that were meant to last, of pouring one's heart into a legacy. She carefully edited her story, omitting the name of her company, excising any detail that would connect her to the case docket sitting on his future desk. As she talked, she studied him. In the soft, flickering firelight, she saw the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the immense weight of his world etched onto his face. This was not a monster. This was not an adversary. This was a good, honorable man trapped in the same impossible web as she was. And as she watched him, as she listened to the deep, calming timbre of his voice, she felt herself falling for him, completely and irrevocably. He leaned forward at one point, his expression earnest, his eyes holding hers with a magnetic intensity. "It's rare," he said, his voice a low murmur, "to meet someone who speaks the same language." And she knew he wasn't talking about English. He was talking about the silent language of the soul, the one they had spoken on the balcony, the one they were speaking now. Even through their carefully constructed omissions, the brandy he had poured her was warm and smooth, but it was the warmth of his attention, of his presence, that truly seeped into her, chasing away the last of her fear and replacing it with a deep, aching tenderness. The night deepened. The rest of the mansion fell into a profound silence, and it felt as if they were the only 2 people left in the world. As her eyes grew heavy with drink and emotion, he saw not a litigant, but the woman he had danced with under the stars. Andrew noticed the exact moment exhaustion began to claim her. He saw the slight softening of her focus, the way her eyelids grew heavy as she fought to keep them open. The emotional toll of the night, the fantasy, the shock, the fragile truce they had built by the fire, had finally caught up to her. With a quiet grace that seemed inherent to his every movement, he stood, bringing their conversation to a gentle, unspoken close. There was no question of him showing her to a guest room. The lines had been redrawn the moment he'd seen the terror on her face. To take her to a bedroom now would be a transgression, a violation of the fragile trust they were building. Instead, he walked to a large, comfortable-looking sofa that faced the fireplace and began arranging the cushions, transforming it into a makeshift bed. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated care. Nancy watched him, her heart aching with a strange mix of gratitude and despair. He was a good man, a truly good and honorable man, and that only made their situation 1,000 times more tragic. He retrieved a thick, impossibly soft cashmere blanket from a wooden chest at the foot of the sofa, the fabric unfolding like a cloud in his hands. He came back to her and waited for her to stand before gently draping the blanket over her shoulders. "You should get some sleep," he said softly. "The world can wait until morning." As she moved toward the sofa, he guided her with a hand on her back, a touch that was both respectful and possessively warm. She lay down, the leather cool against her back before the blanket's warmth enveloped her. He tucked the blanket around her, his movements efficient and tender. For a fleeting second, his fingers brushed against her cheek, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated longing through her entire being. She had to clench her fists to keep from reaching up and capturing his hand with her own. He pulled away as if burned, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden electricity between them. She expected him to leave, to retreat to his own wing of the mansion. Instead, he pulled his armchair closer to the sofa, settling into it like a sentinel. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound book from the side table, but didn't open it. He was simply going to sit there, a silent guardian in the dying firelight, and watch over her as she slept. The powerful, formidable judge was going to spend the night protecting her from the nightmares he was inadvertently causing. She fell asleep in the heart of the storm, watched over by the man who was its cause. The first thing Nancy became aware of was the light, not the harsh glare of a full sun, but a soft, pearlescent grey light filtering through the tall arched windows of the library. It was the gentle, quiet light of dawn. The second sensation was the comforting weight of the cashmere blanket and the profound, almost primal sense of safety she felt beneath it. The fire had burned down to a pile of softly glowing embers, and the mansion was wrapped in a deep and reverent silence. She turned her head, her cheek rubbing against the smooth leather of the sofa. The armchair opposite her was empty. A sharp, illogical pang of disappointment hit her with surprising force. He was gone. The night, with all its impossible magic and its terrifying reality, was over. Perhaps it was for the best. In the light of day, he had surely come to his senses and put a proper professional distance between them. Then she saw him. He was standing by the far window, his back to her, looking out at the calm, slate-grey canvas of the morning sea. He held a ceramic coffee mug in his hands and was already dressed for the day in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. The transformation was startling. He was no longer the masked stranger from the ball, nor the gentle, vulnerable companion from the fireside. He was Judge Andrew Scott, a figure of quiet, unassailable authority. He must have heard the soft rustle of the blanket as she sat up, because he turned. A small, almost sad smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, she now saw, were filled with the same conflict that was tearing her apart. "Good morning," he said, his voice quiet, formal. The warmth of the previous night was gone, replaced by a careful, measured distance. He knew. In the clear, unforgiving light of day, he knew something had shifted irrevocably between them. Nancy pushed the blanket away, the cashmere pooling in her lap. The time for masks, for half-truths, for conversations of careful omissions was over. The game had ended at sunrise. She had to face the man, the judge, and the impossible situation their single night together had created. She had to put a name to the terror he had seen in her eyes. It was the only way forward, even if forward meant a painful, abrupt end. She stood up, her bare feet cold against the polished wood floor. He watched her, his expression unreadable, waiting. The entire future of her company, her family's legacy and her own heart, rested on what she would say next. She owed him the truth, knowing it would be the very thing that would tear them apart. She took a single, steadying breath, the cool morning air a sharp contrast to the firestorm of anxiety in her chest. Andrew waited, his stillness a form of patience that was almost more unnerving than an interrogation would have been. He had given her the floor, and the silence in the vast library was absolute, waiting to be filled with a truth that would shatter it completely. She met his gaze directly, holding it, because she owed him that much. She owed him the dignity of her honesty. "Last night," she began, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo off the thousands of books that surrounded them. "You asked me if I was all right. I wasn't." She saw a flicker of concern in his eyes, the protector in him rising to the surface again. She had to push past that, to get to the heart of the matter before she lost her nerve. "It was when you took off your mask. I know who you are, Judge Scott." The title, spoken aloud between them for the first time, felt like a foreign object, sharp and cold. He didn't react. His expression remained carefully neutral, but she saw a subtle shift in his posture, a man bracing for an impact. She pressed on, knowing there was no turning back. "My name is Nancy Sanders," she stated, letting the name and all its catastrophic implications settle in the air between them. "My family's company is Sanders Engineering." She watched his face as the pieces clicked into place. It was not a sudden explosion of anger or accusation. It was a slow, dawning horror, a wave of comprehension that washed the remaining warmth from his features, leaving behind the stark, pale stone of his judicial mask. He closed his eyes for a single, pained moment, and in that brief darkness, she saw the man from the library mourn the death of the night they had shared. When he opened them again, the connection was gone. He was looking at her, but he was seeing a case file, a conflict, a complication that threatened the very foundation of his world. "The patent case," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Northwood Industries," it wasn't a question. It was the final damning fact. "Yes," she whispered, her heart breaking with the finality of it. "Your case." The confession was complete. It lay between them, a chasm that no amount of desire or connection could ever hope to bridge. She had handed him the weapon that would force him to destroy any possibility of them. The truth was a wall of glass between them, invisible but unbreakable. His first instinct, she saw, was purely professional. It was a reflex born from years on the bench, a lifetime of upholding the law. He turned away from her, walking back towards the window that overlooked the sea, putting physical distance between them, as if she were a piece of inadmissible evidence. He ran a hand through his hair, a single gesture of profound frustration that he quickly suppressed. When he turned back to face her, the transformation was complete. "I had no idea," he said, his voice clipped and formal. It wasn't an apology or an excuse. It was a statement of fact for a record that didn't exist. "You must believe that. My attendance at the Bull was anonymous. Your invitation was from the charity, not from me personally." He was already building a case, establishing the integrity of his position, erasing any hint of impropriety. He was erasing them. "I believe you, Andrew," she said, the use of his first name a desperate, foolish attempt to reclaim the man she had connected with. "It was a mistake." She saw him flinch, his jaw tightening. "You will refer to me as Judge Scott," he corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words were a slap, a cold splash of water that extinguished the last glowing ember of their night together. "Ms. Sanders, you must understand the gravity of this situation. Your presence in my home, our interaction, it constitutes a gross ethical breach, one that I must now rectify." He was speaking like a judge now, laying out the parameters of their new reality. The man who had gently draped a blanket over her was gone, replaced by this cold arbiter of rules. "There can be no further contact between us, none. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a glance in a public place. Is that understood?" he demanded, his voice hard as stone. She could only nod, a knot forming in her throat that made it impossible to speak. She was watching the man she was falling in love with methodically, necessarily painfully, sever every thread that had connected them. He was not just ending their story, he was ensuring it could never be told, wiping its existence from the official record of his life. He was erasing the man from the library, leaving only the judge. The silence that followed his decree was heavy and absolute. The library, which had felt like a warm, intimate sanctuary just hours before, now felt like a cold and cavernous courtroom where she had already been judged and sentenced. Andrew, Judge Scott, stood like a statue carved from granite, his face an unreadable mask of judicial duty. But Nancy could see the cost of that duty in the rigid set of his shoulders and the white-knuckled grip of his hands. Clasped tightly behind his back, he finally broke the silence, his voice low but unwavering. "Nancy," he said, and the slip, the use of her first name, was a crack in his formidable armor. It was a single, unguarded moment of pain that told her everything she needed to know. He corrected himself instantly. "Ms. Sanders, you have to go now." It was not a cruel dismissal. It was a painful, urgent necessity, an act of professional surgery that had to be done quickly. She nodded again, unable to trust her voice. She turned and walked toward the great wooden doors, every step feeling like a mile across a barren landscape. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her back, a silent, heavy pressure. The cashmere blanket lay puddled on the floor by the sofa, a soft, sad reminder of a tenderness that was now forbidden. She did not look back at it. At the threshold of the library, she paused, her hand on the cold brass handle. She allowed herself one last look. He hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, a solitary, powerful figure framed by the soft morning light, his expression one of profound, restrained loss. Their eyes met across the room, and in that final, silent glance, they said all the things they could never speak aloud. The apology, the regret, the sorrow, the undeniable. Impossible pull. She opened the door and stepped out, pulling it closed behind her. The soft, heavy click of the latch was the sound of a final, irrevocable ending. She walked through the silent corridors of the mansion, the art on the walls now seeming to mock her with its timeless beauty. A house steward appeared as if from nowhere and escorted her to the main entrance, where her car, now repaired, was waiting. As she drove away from the sentinel, the magnificent mansion shrinking in her rearview mirror until it was just a speck on the cliffs, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. She wasn't just leaving a house. She was leaving the possibility of happiness behind. Weeks bled into a month of agonizing, deafening silence. Nancy threw herself into her work with a ferocious dedication, using long hours and complex engineering problems as a shield against the memory of a moonlit balcony and a fireside conversation. Her small, functional apartment felt more constricting than ever, a world away from the quiet, book-lined opulence of his library. Sometimes at night, she thought she could still smell the faint scent of wood smoke and old leather on her clothes. The courtroom became their new, unwilling sanctuary. It was a sterile, impersonal space, the polar opposite of the warm, intimate library where they had shared their secrets. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish and anxiety. Here the rules were rigid, the roles clearly defined. He was Judge Andrew Scott, an impartial and powerful figure perched high on the bench. She was Ms. Nancy Sanders, the plaintiff, a name on a docket. He never looked at her, not directly. She would feel his gaze sweep across her table, a professional survey of the room, but his eyes never lingered. He was meticulously, painfully fair. His rulings were precise, his logic unassailable. To everyone else in that courtroom, he was a master of his craft, a man of unimpeachable integrity. No one could ever guess that the judge and the plaintiff had once danced in the dark. This new forced proximity was a unique and exquisite form of torture. Every time he spoke, his deep, resonant voice filling the chamber, she heard the echoes of his whispers on the balcony. She studied the way he held his hands, the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when the opposing counsel's arguments became particularly aggressive. It was a silent, agonizing ballet conducted across a battlefield of legal jargon. She had resigned herself to this painful reality, accepting that their story had been a single, beautiful chapter in a book that was now permanently closed. She believed the man she had met was gone forever, buried beneath the black robes of the judge. She had accepted that all that was left was this cold, professional distance until one rainy afternoon, when his world reached out to hers. Court had adjourned for the day, the sky outside matching the somber mood of the proceedings with a cold, steady drizzle. Nancy pulled up the collar of her trench coat, preparing to make a dash for her car. As she stepped out from under the grand stone portico of the courthouse, a sleek black car purred to a stop directly in front of her, its dark-tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. The passenger window glided down with a soft hum. Inside was not Andrew but his driver, a stoic, silver-haired man she vaguely recognized from the mansion. He looked directly at her, his expression neutral, and extended a hand. In it was a small, crisp, unmarked white envelope. He didn't speak a word. The entire exchange was silent, clandestine, and felt incredibly dangerous. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Her mind screamed at her to refuse it, to walk away and uphold the boundary Andrew, Judge Scott, had so forcefully erected. But her hand had a will of its own. It reached out, her trembling fingers taking the envelope from the driver. The window glided back up, and the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the grey, rain-slicked traffic as silently as it had arrived. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, rain darkening the shoulders of her coat, clutching the small envelope as if it were a live thing. It felt warm against her cold skin. Hurrying to the relative privacy of her car, she tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was not a letter, not a single written word of explanation or confession. Inside was a single, perfectly preserved, pressed, night-blooming jasmine. The scent, faint but unmistakable, rose from the delicate, paper-thin petals. It was the scent of the balcony. It was the scent of the beginning. It was a reckless, impossible, and deeply romantic message. It was a confirmation that the man she'd met was not gone. He was still in there, fighting against the judge, reaching for her across an unbridgeable divide. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of the fragile flower. She realized she hadn't just spent a night in his arms. She had left her heart in his library. The small pressed jasmine was a ghost in her palm. Nancy sat on the edge of her sofa, the city lights painting shifting patterns on her apartment walls, but her entire world had shrunk to the delicate paper-thin petals resting in her hand. The scent, though faint, was a powerful necromancer, resurrecting the night on the balcony with breathtaking clarity. She could almost feel the cool stone of the balustrade under her hands, taste the salt on the air, and hear the deep, resonant timbre of his voice murmuring beside her. It was a memory so potent, so visceral, it felt more real than the room she was sitting in. This flower wasn't just a message, it was a time machine, a key that unlocked a moment when everything was possible, before their names had become barriers. She spent hours just looking at it. She studied the intricate web of veins on the petals, the way they had become almost translucent in the process of being preserved. He had chosen this. He had taken the time to find a bloom, to press it, to keep it safe, and then, in an act of beautiful, reckless desperation, had found a way to get it to her. The logistics of it were staggering, a testament to the resources and the will of the man. But it was the sentiment, the sheer unadulterated romance of the gesture that truly undid her. In a world of legal briefs and cold hard facts, he had sent her poetry. He had sent her a piece of the one perfect night they had shared. As the evening deepened, her understanding of him began to shift, to recalibrate. The cold, harsh judge who had dismissed her from his library that morning was a fiction, a role he had been forced to play. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, but this time she heard the words beneath the words. "You will refer to me as Judge Scott." It hadn't been an assertion of dominance. It had been an act of separation, a necessary severing to protect the integrity of his courtroom. "You have to go now." It hadn't been a dismissal. It had been an act of protection, a desperate attempt to shield her from the fallout of their impossible proximity. His coldness had been a shield, not a sword. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, a prisoner of the very honor and integrity that made him so admirable. And in his silent, lonely world, he had been thinking of her. This flower was the proof. It was a whisper across a chasm, a confirmation that the connection she had felt, the one she had begun to doubt in the harsh light of day, was just as real for him. He was not just an arbiter of her future. He was a fellow captive in their shared, impossible circumstance. A profound and aching tenderness washed over her, so powerful it felt like a physical wave, leaving in its wake a love that was fierce, unconditional, and absolute. She carefully opened a heavy textbook on structural dynamics, its pages filled with the cold, comforting certainty of physics and mathematics. With the gentle touch of a historian handling a priceless artifact, she placed the jasmine between two pages, closing the book on the fragile secret. It was a promise tucked away in a world of logic, a piece of impossible magic hidden within the pages of science. The flower was a silent testament to the man she now knew he was, a protective hero, bound by duty, who had found a way to tell her, without a single word, that he was waiting. That night, for the first time in months, Nancy slept soundly. She did not dream of losing her company, or of hostile lawyers. She dreamed of a garden filled with night-blooming jasmine, and of a man with sad, kind eyes who was waiting for her at the end of a long, winding path. She was no longer a plaintiff, fighting a losing battle against a powerful judge. She was a woman in love, patiently waiting for the moment the world would finally allow them to be together. The courtroom would no longer be a place of fear, but a place of shared endurance. The morning of the verdict dawned grey and heavy, the sky a pearlescent sheet of cloud that seemed to press down on the city. Nancy stood before her closet, the simple act of choosing what to wear feeling momentous, freighted with a significance that went far beyond mere appearance. She bypassed the severe, dark power suits that had become her uniform, her armor for the courtroom. They felt wrong today. They belonged to a woman who was fighting a war, but Nancy was no longer at war. She was bearing witness. She was waiting for the final act of a play whose ending she couldn't predict, but whose central truth she now understood. Her fingers finally settled on a simple, elegant, navy blue dress. It was the color of the ocean at dusk, the color of the sky on the night they had met. It was a dress of quiet dignity, not of aggression. It had no sharp lines, no defensive padding in the shoulders. It was soft, fluid, and unapologetically feminine. Wearing it felt like a declaration of a different kind of strength, not the strength to fight, but the strength to endure, to trust. It was a silent message to him, a signal across the crowded courtroom that she understood. She was not the plaintiff, Miss Sanders, today. She was Nancy. The drive to the courthouse was a surreal journey, through a city that was oblivious to the personal apocalypse scheduled to occur in a downtown courtroom at 10 a.m. People rushed along the sidewalks, clutching cups of coffee, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. They were all living in their own stories, unaware of the silent, epic romance and the impossible ethical dilemma that was about to reach its climax just a few blocks away. For Nancy, the world had a muffled quality, as if she were moving through it underwater, the sounds of the traffic and the city a distant roar. The only thing that felt real was the frantic, steady beat of her own heart. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, the familiar wood cool and solid beneath her hands. The air in the courtroom was thick with a unique blend of stale air, expensive cologne, and a palpable collective anxiety. Reporters were already in their seats, pens poised over notebooks, their faces etched with a predatory curiosity. Her own legal team offered her tight, encouraging smiles, but she could see the strain in their eyes. To them, this was the culmination of months of work, the final roll of the dice. To Nancy, it was something else entirely. It was a crossroads, and she was prepared to walk down whichever path was chosen, as long as it was a path of honor. Then came the bailiff's call. "All rise." The words, spoken with practiced authority, sent a jolt through the room. A heavy door opened and Andrew entered. He moved with his usual deliberate grace, a river of black fabric flowing around him. But she saw the immense, crushing weight he carried. It was in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the dark, sleepless shadows under his eyes, that even his formidable composure couldn't entirely hide. He ascended the steps to the bench as if they were a mountain, and as he sat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the judgment of a god. He looked up, and for a single, infinite moment, his eyes met hers. It was not a slip this time. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, conscious, and final act of communication. In that fleeting glance, she saw everything he couldn't say. She saw the man from the library, his eyes filled with a profound and painful resolve. It was a look of apology for what he was about to do, of longing for what they could never have, and of a solemn, heartbreaking farewell to the world he had built. He was about to burn it all to the ground, and this look was his only explanation. She knew with a sudden, heart-stopping certainty that this would not be a verdict. It would be a confession. The silence in the courtroom was a living thing. It was absolute, a perfect vacuum that seemed to draw all the air from Nancy's lungs. Every nervous cough, every rustle of paper had ceased. There was only the towering figure of Andrew on the bench and the collective, suspended breath of 100 people. He cleared his throat, and the small human sound, amplified by the microphone, seemed to crash through the stillness like a stone thrown into a placid lake. He methodically arranged a stack of papers on the dais before him, a familiar ritual that today felt like a deliberate slowing of time, a drawing out of the final excruciating moments. He looked out over the assembled faces, his gaze sweeping past the anxious lawyers, the impassive jury, the hungry press. It was the gaze of a commander surveying his battlefield one last time. And then his eyes found hers. They landed on her and they stayed. He was no longer looking at the plaintiff. He was looking at Nancy. It was a look that held her, that anchored her, that prepared her for the coming storm. It was a look that said, "Watch me. This is for you. Remember this." It was the most intimate gaze they had ever shared, and it was happening in the most public of forums. "Before I deliver the verdict on case number 734, Sanders Engineering versus Northwood Industries," he began, and his voice was a force of nature. It was steady, powerful, each word carefully enunciated, ringing with an undeniable and solemn authority that filled every corner of the vast room. The reporters leaned forward in unison, pens hovering. Her own lawyers tensed, anticipating the final judgment. But Nancy watched his eyes. She saw the infinitesimal flicker of pain that he masked with a will of iron. A confused, excited murmur rippled through the gallery at his unorthodox preamble. This was not protocol. This was not how verdicts were delivered. Andrew ignored it, his focus entirely singular. "I must make a statement to the court," he continued, his voice unwavering. He was now speaking directly to the law itself, to the institution to which he had dedicated his life. Nancy's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, sensing that he was on the edge of a precipice, and he was about to jump. Upon a thorough and final reflection of the proceedings, he said, pausing for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of his words settle, "And upon a deep examination of my position as the arbiter of this case, I have come to the conclusion that I can no longer preside over this matter with the complete and unquestionable impartiality that justice demands." The words dropped into the silence like stones, each one sending out concentric rings of shock. Gasps, sharp and audible, filled the room. The opposing counsel's jaw literally dropped. He had just confessed to a flaw. The great Judge Scott, the arbitrator, had just admitted to being compromised. He let the chaos build for a moment, a masterful display of control. Then he raised his voice slightly, cutting through the noise. "Therefore," he declared, his eyes locked on Nancy's, a burning final message passing between them, "I, Judge Andrew Scott, do hereby officially recuse myself from this case, effective immediately." It was not a verdict. It was a detonation. He had just pulled the pin on his entire career, sacrificing it on the altar of his own integrity, and in doing so, he had set her and himself free. His gavel remained untouched. His words were the only judgment he would render. For a single suspended moment that seemed to stretch into the length of a lifetime, the world held its breath. The word immediately echoed and then faded, leaving behind a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, and in that vacuum Nancy saw everything with a startling, crystalline clarity. She saw the man on the bench, not as a judge, but as a king, deliberately, methodically, and single-handedly dismantling his own kingdom. He had not just recused himself. He had performed a public act of self-immolation, sacrificing a lifetime of unimpeachable credibility on an altar that only she could see. The shock in the room was a physical force, a wave of palpable disbelief that washed over her, but she felt strangely calm, an island of understanding in a sea of confusion. Then the dam of silence broke. It wasn't a singular crash, but 1,000 simultaneous fractures. The rustle of paper became a roar as reporters flipped frantically through their notes. The low murmur of the gallery erupted into a cascade of sharp, overlapping whispers. Keyboards began to clatter with a frantic, percussive intensity, a digital chorus narrating the fall of a legend. Her own legal team was on its feet, their faces a gallery of astonishment and confusion. Her lead counsel turned to her, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment before he managed to whisper, "What in God's name just happened? Did he just hand us a mistrial?" He saw it as a legal strategy, a procedural anomaly. He couldn't possibly comprehend the epic personal story that had just reached its climax. Nancy could only shake her head, a slow, disbelieving motion. Because she knew. Oh, she knew. This wasn't a legal maneuver. This was the ultimate romantic gesture, a declaration so profound and so public, it dwarfed any whispered words on a moonlit balcony. He hadn't just given her a fighting chance in court. He had given her his entire world. He had publicly, in a forum where reputation was the only currency that mattered, declared himself unfit, compromised, flawed. He had invited the wolves of speculation and scandal to the very doorstep of his fiercely private life. He had chosen this path not to save her company, but to save her from the impossible, corrosive position their connection had placed her in. He was absorbing all the poison, taking all the suspicion, shouldering the entire weight of their impossible situation so that she could walk away clean. Tears, hot and unrestrained, welled in her eyes, blurring the chaotic scene before her into a watercolor painting of shock. They were not tears of relief for Sanders' engineering. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking love for the man, for his incredible, quiet and devastating courage. She thought of the pressed jasmine, that secret, fragile promise, and realized this was its full, terrible bloom. This was what he had been planning all along. The sheer breathtaking nobility of the act, the quiet, profound strength it took to set a controlled fire to your own life for the sake of your principles, was the most beautiful and painful thing she had ever witnessed. He was a protective hero, yes, but this was more. This was a man setting his own shield down and choosing to stand, vulnerable and exposed, for the woman he loved. Amidst the growing chaos, Andrew remained a figure of impossible calm. He stood, the black robe settling around him one last time, a symbol of the power he was so willingly relinquishing. He adjusted the fabric, his movements precise and deliberate, his face an unreadable mask of calm. But Nancy could see what no one else could. She saw the subtle release of a tension in his shoulders that he must have been carrying for weeks. A burden of impossible weight finally set down. He had made his choice. He had chosen his honor over his reputation, his integrity over his legacy. He had chosen the man he was over the judge he was supposed to be. And in doing so, he had reclaimed his own soul. The bailiff was on his feet now, his voice a booming, futile cry for order in the court. But there was no order to be found. Andrew turned his back to the pandemonium, his gaze sweeping one last time over the room he had commanded for so long. He did not look at the shocked faces of the lawyers or the frantic gestures of the court clerk. He did not look at Nancy. He didn't need to. His final public act had been his message to her. He walked from the bench, his steps even and unhurried, a solitary king abdicating his throne. The heavy doors of the chamber swung closed behind him, the soft, definitive click of the latch a sound of absolute finality. The powerful Judge Scott was gone, and Nancy knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very marrow of her bones, that somewhere on the other side of that door, her Andrew was waiting for the rest of their story to begin. The judge was gone. In his place, her Andrew was waiting. The click of the chamber door latch acted as a starting pistol in Nancy's soul. The world, which had seemed to be moving in a blurry, slow motion, snapped into sharp, urgent focus. A primal, undeniable instinct took over, a force as powerful as magnetism, pulling her from her seat, pulling her toward him. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping a harsh, discordant shriek against the polished floor, a sound that cut through the buzz of the courtroom. Her lawyer reached a hand out, his mouth forming her name, a question in his eyes, but she was already past him, a ship that had already set its course for a distant, hopeful shore. "I have to go," she murmured, the words a sacred vow to herself. She didn't see the reporters whose heads swiveled in her direction, their journalistic instincts alight with the scent of a story far greater than a patent dispute. Her entire universe had narrowed to a singular point, the man who had just walked through that door. She ran. Her professional, sensible heels, so at odds with the frantic urgency of her heart, hammered a desperate staccato rhythm on the cold marble floors of the courthouse corridors. Each click echoed in the vast cathedral-like space, a lonely sound in a world of institutional silence. She ran past clerks carrying stacks of files, past lawyers engaged in hushed conversations, their surprised faces blurring in her peripheral vision. The corridors seemed to stretch on for miles, a labyrinth of beige walls and fluorescent lights, designed to drain the life and passion from human affairs. But today she was a river of pure emotion, carving a path through the sterile landscape. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. What if she was too late? What if this grand, noble sacrifice was his final act? A final goodbye, and he was already being whisked away in his black car, back to his fortress of solitude on the coast. What if she was left with only the echo of his sacrifice, a beautiful, tragic story with a missing final chapter? The fear was a spur, driving her faster. She burst through the heavy bronze doors of the main entrance, pushing them open with a force that sent them swinging wildly on their hinges. The sudden sensory shock of the outside world was staggering. The cool, damp city air filled her lungs, a welcome antidote to the stale, charged atmosphere of the courtroom. The symphony of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the indifferent chatter of passers-by, rushed in to meet her. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the plaza was a meaningless jumble of movement and concrete. She scanned the crowded space, her eyes darting from face to face, from car to car, searching for a single familiar silhouette. He wasn't there. The black car was nowhere in sight. A wave of despair, cold and sharp as ice water, washed over her. She had misunderstood. It had been an ending, not an invitation, a noble act to set her free, not to bring them together. She stood frozen, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar, her hope beginning to crumble. And then she saw him. He was not fleeing. He was not hiding. He was standing by the grand central fountain, a good 50 yards away, a solitary, patient figure amidst the relentless motion of the city. He had not gone. He was waiting. He had trusted her. He had trusted that she would understand the true meaning of his actions, that she would hear the question he had asked without words. He had taken off his heavy judicial robes. They were folded with a strange formal neatness over his arm, a burden he had carried and was now ready to set down. He was just a man in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, watching the play of the light on the cascading water, waiting for her. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming. It was a physical sensation, a warmth that spread from her chest through her entire body. Chasing away the cold dread, she slowed her frantic pace to a walk, her heart so full she felt it might actually burst. She approached him slowly, deliberately, savoring every footstep of this new unwritten chapter. This was not a chase. This was a homecoming. He turned as he heard her approach, as if he had been attuned to the sound of her footsteps all along. A slow, genuine smile, the first truly unguarded, unburdened smile she had ever received from him, spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, a smile that erased all the tension, all the pain, all the impossible weight of the past weeks. It was the smile of a man who had just navigated his way through a storm and found his safe harbor. "Is this considered improper ex parte communication, Your Honor?" she asked softly as she finally reached him, her voice trembling slightly but a playful, courageous light returning to her eyes. He looked down at the heavy black robe still draped over his arm, a symbol of a life he had just left behind. Then he looked at her. With a deliberate, symbolic gesture, he walked to a nearby stone bench and laid the robes down, shedding the last vestige of the office that had separated them. He returned to her, closing the final few inches of distance between them. He took her hands in his grip warm and strong, a physical anchor in a world that had just been remade. "Andrew," he corrected her, his voice a low, intimate murmur, a sound meant only for her. "My name is Andrew, and I would say, after everything we have been through, this is the only communication that matters." He lifted a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb gently, reverently brushing away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. "I believe I owe you a proper dance," he said, his eyes so full of warmth and promise crinkling at the corners. One without masks, without secrets, without a courtroom in sight. And there in the middle of the courthouse plaza, with the entire world as their witness, Andrew Scott kissed Nancy Sanders. It was not a kiss of stolen, secret passion in the shadows, but a kiss of public, profound promise in the bright, clear light of day. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom, of honor, and of a triumphant, hard-won beginning. It was the closing of one book and the opening of another, a story they would now finally be free to write together. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Your support means everything. Hit the bell so you never miss the next luxury romance, and tell me in the comments from which country are you watching tonight. I can't wait to know.